Hey guys, tonight we crack open something that feels like it should belong in your grandmother's kitchen cupboard, but instead has been sitting in the damp air of Java for 1,000 years. Imagine yourself prying the lid off a squat wooden box, a little warped by time. The hinges squeaking in protest like they'd rather you left the contents alone. A faint smell drifts out. Not rotten, not fresh, but that musty in-between. The scent of coconut husk smoke and forgotten cloth. And inside you discover what scholars politely call household miscellany. But you and I both know translates directly to junk drawer. Yes, even people in the 11th century apparently needed a place to shove half-broken odds and ends. You probably won't survive this one, not because of curses or anything, but simply from sheer boredom as we inventory ancient clutter. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now and what time is it? I'm always amazed at the comments from people wide awake at 3 a.m. in Oslo, or drifting off in Jakarta just after sunset. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lean closer to the drawer. It's not grand treasure, no golden crowns, no jeweled swords, nothing a museum would spend millions to acquire. Instead, you see a muddle, a chip of ceramic wedged between a spindle, a palm leaf slip, brittle as potato chip crust, a rusty bit of metal that could be either a nail or an old fishhook. This drawer is chaos, but it's an everyday chaos. And that's what makes it precious, because through it you glimpse life as it was lived in Java around 1,000 years ago. Not just the parts polished for temple inscriptions or royal court records, but the sloppy background noise of existence. You notice the wood itself. Teak, probably. Teak has been the Javanese standard since forever, its natural oils keeping insects mostly at bay. Still, termites had their feasts. A scholar in Yogyakarta once pointed out that storage boxes like this were common in wealthier households. Poorer folk might not have had enough stuff to justify a drawer at all. Historians still argue whether this drawer belonged to a merchant's family, a temple servant, or maybe even a minor official in the royal bureaucracy. Running your fingers across the lip of the box, you feel little notches carved into it. Were they purely decorative or functional tally marks? Hard to say. One fringe theory suggests they were lunar notations, the owner scratching reminders about market days or temple festivals. Fringe, but fun. The mainstream fact is that Javanese households did store everyday clutter in chests, usually pushed under sleeping platforms made of bamboo. And here you are, staring at one. It doesn't look like much. Most of the objects are corroded, broken, or partial, but every bit whispers a tiny story. Imagine a kid being told to clean the mat before guests came over, sweeping up a marble and a broken comb and just shoving them all in here. Imagine a grandmother reaching in for incense beads and finding instead a rusty spindle. It's relatable chaos. One of the first things you pick up is not even an object but a layer of fine dust mixed with insect fragments. You sneeze and the sound echoes in your mind against the backdrop of an 11th century Javanese house. Woven bamboo walls, clay-tiled roof, the hum of cicadas outside. It's all there, silent but waiting. Your modern brain wants to categorize. Drawer contents usually fall into 3 piles: useful, sentimental, or trash. Here, though, those categories blur. What looks like trash to you, say a corroded needle stub, might have been seen as still potentially useful. Sentimental? Maybe a seashell once gifted by a child. And yet, over the centuries, utility faded, sentiment evaporated, and only the husk of the object remained. And you can't help but chuckle at the timelessness of it. People 1,000 years ago shoved random objects into a box, just like you shoved dead batteries, twist ties, and single socks into a kitchen drawer. Progress marches on, but junk drawers are eternal. The deeper you dig, the more peculiar the mixture seems. A coin lies wedged between 2 palm leaf strips, as if someone absent-mindedly used it as a bookmark. A chip of pottery carries faint traces of turmeric staining, turning the shard a dull gold. A fragment of wood with a hole drilled through it. Was it once part of a tool or just an experiment in drilling gone wrong? You'll never know. And the quiet humor of it all? Great stone temples like Borobudur stand only a few valleys away. Inscriptions carved in perfect Sanskrit poetry survive. Yet here you are, obsessing over someone's stash of half-broken pencils and seashells. This is the archaeological equivalent of snooping through the junk drawer at a dinner party. Nobody asked you to, but once you start, you can't stop. You place the lid aside carefully, dust motes swirling up and catching the light. It feels oddly ceremonial, like you're not just opening a drawer, but opening time itself. Your ears imagine faint echoes, a child laughing, a pestle pounding cloves, a rooster complaining in the distance. They're not really there, of course, but the drawer invites you to project them, the way a seashell makes you hear the sea. And as you sit back, you realize this box, unimpressive as it may look, is about to swallow 2 whole hours of your night. 2 hours of wandering through objects nobody valued enough to display, but someone valued enough not to throw away. 1,000 years later, you're the one holding them in your imagination. And that's the quiet magic of a Javanese junk drawer. You tip the box a little, and the first real cascade begins. Small clinks, dull thuds, and the faint tap of something hollow. Out spills the kind of odd assortment you might expect if a pocket emptied itself over centuries. A thin copper cash coin with a square hole punched right through its center. A string of beads where only 3 survive on a frayed thread, and a palm-sized token carved with a design so worn it could be a lotus, or maybe just a circle that lost its meaning along the way. You pick up the coin first. It's lightweight, more a symbol than a fortune. Coins like this arrived in Java via Chinese trade during the Song dynasty, when copper cash with their neat square holes were strung together and counted by the string, not the piece. One historian swears some of these coins even served as fashion accessories, threaded into belts or sewn onto clothing for a little extra shine. But others argue they had little monetary use here, becoming more like charms than currency. Historians still argue whether Javanese villages truly relied on cash coins for everyday trade, or if barter and rice remained the primary currency. Either way, this lonely coin ended up tossed into the drawer, its hole threaded with dust instead of string. Next, the beads. Smooth, dark with time, 1 or 2 show the faint glint of glass, likely imported. Java sat in the thick of the Indian Ocean trade network, so beads traveled in from India, Persia, even further. Some beads were talismans, believed to protect against illness or ward off jealousy. Others were just pretty. You roll one between your fingers and imagine a child once wearing them proudly the strand, breaking one careless afternoon, the survivors scooped up and shoved in here, destined for centuries of obscurity. Then there's the mystery token. It's a disc of baked clay, no bigger than a cookie, and stamped with a pattern that resists interpretation. Was it a temple admission marker? A gaming piece? A merchant's seal? One fringe theory claims such tokens were used in local shadow puppet troupes, given as entry passes to a wayang performance. Another insists they were devotional objects, meant to be offered at shrines. The truth is, no one knows, but isn't that perfect? A mystery token in a junk drawer, the 11th century equivalent of, what is this part even for, when you open your modern toolbox? You can almost hear the exasperated sigh of the ancient homeowner. They probably shoved these things inside the drawer muttering, "I'll deal with this later." Spoiler, they did not. Neither did anyone else, until you showed up with your imagination. One odd little fact. Archaeologists in Java often find coins drilled with extra holes, sometimes off-center to be worn as charms. They weren't just money, they were protection. The sound of them jingling on a string was thought to chase off evil spirits. Which is almost funny when you consider how many modern people still insist on carrying lucky pennies or attaching charms to their phones. Some habits outlive empires. And tucked in with these items, you notice a few beads carved from bone. Not fancy, just utilitarian. Maybe from a prayer strand that someone fingered during meditation. The bead edges are worn smooth, the way only repetitive touch can polish. If you hold it to your cheek in imagination, it feels like warmth lingering from 1,000 prayers whispered under the breath. A domestic spirituality that didn't make it into official chronicles, but hummed along just the same. You picture the family who owned this drawer. Maybe they had a small shrine tucked in the corner of their house, smoky with incense. The beads might have been part of that ritual, or maybe they were strung on a child's wrist, something to keep away the spirits that hover around babies. Historians still argue whether such charms were primarily religious or purely protective, and honestly, the line between the two was thin as a palm leaf. And yet, here they all are now. Coin, beads, token, reduced to stuff. It's the quietest kind of tragedy, not a grand loss, but the slow evaporation of meaning. Imagine if someone 1,000 years from now finds your broken keychain, your lucky festival wristband, your subway token, and debates whether it was sacred, decorative, or just trash. That's this exact moment. Still, you smile at the irony. The family who shoved these bits away couldn't have known that someday you'd be tracing their fingerprints in your head. Junk has a funny way of becoming treasure given enough centuries and the right archaeologist with a grant. The last oddment from this handful is a sliver of copper bent into a coil. A failed attempt at a bracelet? A snippet of wire meant to fasten something? Nobody knows. But imagine the owner's thought. Too bent to use, too shaped to toss, so into the drawer it goes. If you're nodding along thinking, yep, that's exactly what I'd do with spare screws, congratulations, you've just time-traveled into the Javanese mindset. So the first tumble of drawer content sets the tone. Objects without obvious use but heavy with possibility. Currency turned into jewelry, beads turned into charms, tokens turned into puzzles for scholars to fight over. And you, turning them slowly in your palm, are halfway between curious thief and sleepy storyteller. It makes you laugh softly because this is exactly how junk drawers work. Meaningless and meaningful at the same time. Each object whispering its little backstory in a language only imagination understands. You shuffle aside the coins and beads and find a darker stain near the bottom of the box. The wood carries faint black smudges like the drawer once hosted something that leaked ink. Nestled in the corner are fragments that, at first glance, look like nothing more than splinters. But as you turn them over, you notice their ends taper to points. These were pens, bamboo nibs split just enough to channel ink onto palm leaf or lontar scrolls. You hold one between your fingers and the grain of the bamboo is clear. Javanese scribes in the 11th century used sharpened bamboo or quills, dipping them into ink made from soot mixed with plant sap. The soot clung stubbornly, which explains the stain still visible here. A mainstream fact. Scribes often wrote on dried palm leaves, etching letters in old Javanese script, then rubbing in black pigment to make the words stand out. These fragments may have belonged to a student or minor clerk who never quite managed neat lines, leaving more blotches than verses. Wedged beside the bamboo is a brittle shard of palm leaf itself. Imagine it once part of a manuscript, strung with others through a small hole and tied with cord. Now it's nothing but a curled brown slip, its letters faded into silence. Some scholars suggest these scraps were practice sheets, students scratching syllables over and over, the way children fill modern notebooks with multiplication tables. Others believe they were actual texts, perhaps household calendars or mantras. Historians still argue whether common households kept written notes, or if literacy was confined to elites. This drawer, with its mix of scribal odds and ends, muddies the picture deliciously. And then you notice the accidental artistry. One scrap shows a faint doodle, maybe a half-drawn bird, maybe just a flourish gone wrong. You smile, realizing even ancient scribes got bored and sketched in the margins. Fringe enthusiasts like to claim these doodles were secret talismans, little protective drawings tucked into texts. Maybe they're right. Or maybe it's just the 11th century version of a student drawing cartoon dragons instead of listening in class. A small hardened clump lies near the stains. Once ink, now fossilized. You sniff it and catch only dust, but if you imagine hard enough, you can smell a charred, resinous odor, like burnt coconut husk. Ink making was a messy, smoky task, and because ink came from soot, sometimes it smelled faintly of cooking fires, merging the domestic and the scholarly in one whiff. You can't help but picture a person hunched by lamplight, scratching away with bamboo, tongue between teeth in concentration while chickens clucked in the background. Writing here wasn't lofty art, it was daily grind. Yet each mark linked the household to the broader world. Trade lists, prayers, or even letters carried across seas. A quirky tidbit? Some Lontar manuscripts were reused. If a scribe ran out of fresh palm leaves, they scraped off old words and wrote anew. Recycling existed long before blue bins. Another sliver in the drawer seems different. Darker, smoother, not bamboo, but maybe imported reed. If so, that's a sign of cultural mixing. Javanese scribes occasionally adopted tools from India or the Middle East, where reed pens were common. It's a reminder that Java wasn't isolated. It was buzzing with influences, just like the beads and coins hinted earlier. As you examine these writing scraps, you think of your own junk drawer. Maybe you've got dead pens rattling around, a dried Sharpie, a pencil stub gnawed halfway down. You didn't throw them out because some irrational part of you thought, maybe it'll work again. Same energy here. Someone tucked away these nibs and scraps because they still had potential. Potential they never lived to use. And isn't it funny? Great chronicles describe kings and battles, temple dedications and epic poetry. But here you're holding the failed pen nib of someone who probably got ink all over their sleeve. It feels like a wink across centuries. Not everything written was grand. Some of it was grocery lists, some of it was practice lines, and some of it ended up in the junk drawer. You turn one last palm leaf scrap over. No words remain, but faint grooves suggest there once were letters. Imagine if the groove spelled out something mundane like, buy more cloves. Imagine if it was a love note. Imagine if it was an unfinished poem that never found its final line. That is the quiet ache of these fragments. They hint at voices, but the voices have gone hoarse. You place them back gently, the drawer now resembling an archaeologist's pencil case. And in the dim hush, you can almost hear the scratching of bamboo on leaf again. A rhythmic rasp in the night air. You nudge aside the scribal fragments, and suddenly the drawer rattles with a different music. The clink of pottery shards, the gritty slide of powdered residue, the faint perfume of spices long evaporated but still lingering as ghost scent. These are the fragments of kitchen life. Ceramic chips, pestle crumbs, and a stub of dried cloves so fragile it looks like it would turn to powder if you breathe too hard. One shard catches your eye first. It's glazed, smooth on one side and rough on the other. The curve of its edge telling you it once belonged to a small bowl. The glaze is greenish, almost jade-like, and that's a clue. Ceramics like this often came from China, part of the vast Song Dynasty trade network. Mainstream fact, Chinese ceramics flooded Southeast Asia during this period, prized for their durability and beauty. A wealthy Javanese household might have owned a handful, mixing them with local earthenware. This particular shard, chipped and useless, found its way into the drawer. Not glamorous, just leftover clutter from someone's breakfast. Beside it lies a simpler fragment, unglazed, thick, and porous. Probably local. If you rub it between your fingers, tiny granules flake away, suggesting it once held something pungent. Maybe tamarind paste or ground turmeric. Historians still argue whether households in inland Java used imported ceramics mainly for special meals while relying on local clayware for everyday cooking. The junk drawer seems to vote for both. Fine imports chipped too soon, sturdy locals worn down from constant pounding. You find a pestle crumb, a smooth lump of stone that might once have been a part of a grinding tool. Imagine it used daily to crush cloves, peppercorns, and candle nuts into sambal paste. A quirky tidbit. Ancient Javanese cookbooks mention candle nuts, which, when crushed, gave sauces a creamy body much like peanuts do today. Someone in this house might have been grinding those very nuts before the pestle cracked. The broken piece quietly swept into the drawer. You smile. Broken kitchen gear never dies. It just migrates into limbo. And then the clove stub. Hardly larger than your fingernail, but potent in the implication. Java was the world's clove capital. Merchants traveled from as far as Arabia to get their hands on these aromatic buds. In Europe, cloves were worth their weight in silver. And here in the junk drawer, a single forgotten stub, dropped during dinner prep, rolled under a mat, later scooped into this wooden box. Imagine world empires shifting because of spices, and yet the evidence survives in a junk drawer like an ancient crumb at the bottom of your toaster. You pause and imagine the kitchen of this household. A clay stove fueled by coconut husks, pots balanced precariously, a family squatting on mats, tearing banana leaves to use as plates, chickens wandering in the doorway, the pestle thudding rhythmically, filling the air with chili fumes. The shard of imported porcelain used for serving something special, maybe rice during a festival, only to chip and get demoted to drawer purgatory. One fringe theory pops up here. Some archaeologists suggest that households deliberately kept broken ceramic fragments because they were believed to have protective powers. Place a shard near your rice bin, and evil spirits wouldn't steal the grain. It sounds a bit far-fetched, but then again, you probably know someone today who swears by keeping a horseshoe above the door. Human superstition is a stubborn beast. You laugh to yourself imagining the universality. Even now, people keep a cracked mug for mixing paint, or a chipped plate for the dog, instead of throwing them away. This family likely did the same, saving shards just in case they were useful again. And when usefulness failed, the drawer absorbed them, no questions asked. You notice faint burn marks on one piece of clay, as if it once sat too close to the fire. The scorch line tells a micro-story of dinner gone wrong, perhaps a pot tilted, rice scorched at the bottom, leaving a family to scrape off the edible top. And because humans are endlessly thrifty, the pot kept being used until it finally cracked. The fragment in your hand carries the record of that small disaster. As you sift through, you realize the drawer is essentially an accidental cookbook. The clove, the turmeric stain, the pestle crumb, all whisper recipes and fragments. If you closed your eyes, you could almost taste the smoky sambal, the tang of tamarind broth, the faint sweetness of coconut milk simmering in clay. And just when you think the kitchen debris has nothing more to say, you uncover a tiny lump of charred rice. It shouldn't have survived 1,000 years, but it has. Hard, blackened, a fossilized grain. It's absurdly ordinary, yet it's also the most human thing you've touched tonight. Someone once cooked this rice, maybe undercooked it, maybe burnt it, maybe just lost a grain that rolled away. And now, here it is, your most direct link to their dinner table. You set the shard, pestle crumb, clove, and rice back into the drawer, and you can't help but chuckle. Great historians write of dynasties and battles, but you, lucky you, are obsessing over someone's leftover kitchen accidents. It's strangely comforting, because if there's one thing history proves, it's that humans across millennia have always been clumsy in the kitchen. The deeper you dig, the more personal the drawer becomes. You shift aside the ceramic crumbs and rice fossil, and suddenly you find evidence of grooming. Tiny relics of someone's appearance, still clinging stubbornly to relevance after 1,000 years. The first piece is a comb, snapped neatly in half, its teeth worn smooth with use. The wood is darkened by age, though if you squint, you can still imagine it being polished and golden in the hand. It's small, pocket-sized. Maybe it once rode tucked into a cloth sash, pulled out during idle moments. Mainstream fact. Combs like this were common across Java and Southeast Asia. carved from wood, bamboo, or even bone. They weren't only for detangling hair, they were essential in a world where lice were a daily reality. A broken comb in a drawer is basically the ancient version of finding half a plastic hairbrush in your bathroom cabinet. Useful once, but not worth repairing. Next to it lies a hairpin. At first it looks like just a sliver of bone, but a closer look shows faint incisions. Decorative lines carved in a spiral? You picture someone pinning up their hair with this every morning, a simple but elegant accessory. Historians still argue whether such pins in domestic contexts were primarily functional or had status attached. Was this drawer hiding the lost pin of a servant, or the cast-off of a merchant's daughter? The truth is invisible now, but the presence of decoration hints at someone who cared about style. And then, tucked in the corner, is a lump. At first it resembles dried mud, but when you rub it, a faint herbal aroma drifts up. Sharp, camphor-like. This was once a cosmetic paste, probably made from spices and crushed aromatic woods. In ancient Java, people applied such mixtures to mask body odors in the humid climate. Some recipes also claim to repel insects. A quirky tidbit. One medieval Javanese text describes a mixture of turmeric and ground crocodile dung as a kind of sunscreen. Whether it worked or just made you smell like a swamp is another matter. Either way, someone clearly experimented with paste, and when the last lump dried out, into the drawer it went. Holding these grooming relics, you imagine the household's daily rhythms. Morning light filtering through woven bamboo walls. A woman combing her hair, pinning it with the bone sliver. A child wriggling under the comb, scratching at lice. A grandmother mixing paste in a small mortar, muttering that it keeps mosquitoes at bay. None of this made it into royal inscriptions, but here it sits in your imagination, summoned by junk. One fringe theory even claims combs were ritual tools, used to comb away bad spirits during certain ceremonies. It sounds poetic, and maybe there's a shred of truth, but more likely this comb simply yanked at knots like every other comb in history. Still, the idea lingers. Someone believing beauty rituals had protective power. The hairpin makes you think of modern analogies. You've probably lost a hair tie or bobby pin, only to find it months later in the couch cushions. Same energy here. This pin, lost during a rushed morning, turned up months later in a sweep, dumped in the drawer because it didn't match the others anymore. Relatable across centuries. As you turn the dried paste over, you think of the sensory world of ancient Java. Cloves, sandalwood, turmeric, lime leaves. The drawer holds their faint ghost scents. The household probably smelled richly spiced, not just from cooking, but from grooming. Imagine the air. Sambal grinding in the kitchen, clove paste rubbed on skin, incense curling from the shrine corner. For a moment, the drawer is less a box of junk and more a perfume cabinet. You can almost hear someone laughing at themselves. Maybe the paste worked poorly, maybe it stained their clothes, maybe the comb broke in mid-use. Little mishaps, tossed aside. These fragments prove something universal. Vanity, hygiene, and the endless clutter they generate are timeless. The broken comb tooth scratches your finger slightly. You smile at the thought that this tiny splinter once served as part of someone's ritual of self-care. And now, you're sitting here centuries later, treating it with the reverence of an artifact. The drawer, in this sense, is a mirror. It reflects how we humans always cling to fragments of beauty, even if they're chipped, cracked, or dried out. You set the comb, pin, and lump back gently. In the silence that follows, you picture the last user smoothing their hair, frowning at their reflection in a water bowl, muttering something universal like, "Close enough." You brush the dried cosmetic paste back into its corner and find, beneath a layer of powdery dust, the unmistakable gleam of metal gone to rust. You pick it up carefully. It's a needle, though blunted at the tip and pitted with age. The eye is still visible, a tiny hole that once held thread. You marvel for a second at how something so small, so ordinary, could survive centuries buried in a box. And yet it makes perfect sense. Someone kept it around long after it snapped or dulled. telling themselves it might come in handy again. Exactly the logic that explains why you've got a drawer full of bent paper clips. Next to it lies a snarl of thread, knotted and tangled into a lump. The fibers are discolored now, a muddy brown gray, but if you tug gently, you can feel the twist of spun cotton. Mainstream fact: by the 10th and 11th centuries, Java was a center of textile production, weaving fine cottons and batik cloth that traveled as far as India and the Middle East. A fragment of thread in this junk drawer is a tiny reminder of that massive trade. You lift the lump closer to your nose. Dust makes you sneeze, but faintly, just faintly, you imagine the smell of plant dye. Indigo, maybe. Historians still argue whether dyeing was done primarily at household level or centralized in specialized workshops. Some think families dyed small batches at home with local plants, while large-scale exporters handled the bulk. Either way, this twisted wad of thread could have been a leftover from mending a shirt, patching a child's pants, or reinforcing a sailcloth seam. Beneath the thread lies something smoother, a spindle whorl carved from bone. It's palm-sized, pierced in the center, once fitted onto a spindle rod for spinning fibers. You turn it in your hand and imagine it whirling, a steady rhythm as someone sat on the bamboo floor, feet tucked beneath them, chatting idly while twisting raw cotton into usable yarn. A quirky tidbit: spindle whorls were often decorated. Some had patterns etched into them, not because they needed to, but because even mundane tools were canvases for beauty. This one bears faint scratches, maybe flowers, or maybe just wear. And here's the funny part: archaeologists sometimes find spindle whorls repurposed as gaming pieces. Once broken or chipped, they might end up in children's play, spun across floors like tops. Maybe this one was halfway there when it got retired to the drawer. You imagine the rhythms of household textile work: the squeak of a loom, the soft snap of thread breaking, the muttered curse as someone reached for this very needle to fix the problem. People think of great temples and seafaring ships when they think of Java's past, but really most life revolved around tasks like this: mending, sewing, patching. And then the debate creeps in. Historians still argue whether the majority of weaving was done by women at home, or whether guilds of professional weavers dominated. Either way, this drawer proves at least one person in this household threaded needles and spun yarn. The fragments say so more loudly than inscriptions ever could. There's a sweet irony here. You can read epics about kings, but holding a rusted needle tells you more about daily survival. You picture a child ripping a hole in their only tunic, a mother sighing, pulling this very needle and thread to patch it, perhaps muttering the 11th century equivalent of, "Didn't I just fix this?" Some frustrations outlive dynasties. One fringe theory even suggests needles themselves were amulets, believed to stitch together not just fabric, but also luck and health. A broken needle might still carry protective power, which could explain why it wasn't simply discarded. Maybe that's why it landed here, preserved like a talisman disguised as trash. The knot of thread makes you chuckle. You've seen that knot before, maybe in your own drawer, a hopeless tangle of old phone cords or Christmas lights. Humanity has always had a knack for entangling. Whoever shoved this thread in probably muttered something like, "I'll untangle it later." They didn't. Neither will you. You place the spindle whorl on top of the thread lump, and for a moment, the drawer feels like a miniature sewing kit. Incomplete, but still telling. The broken needle, the tangled fibers, the bone disc, they're humble artifacts, but they spin out visions of textile markets, batik patterns, and caravans carrying cloth across seas. As you lean back, the drawer almost hums with the sound of whirring spindles and the sigh of someone threading a needle in low light. And you realize that this so-called junk was once the machinery of love and survival, stitching families together one loop at a time. As you ease the spindle whorl back into its corner, your fingers graze something smoother, smaller, and oddly playful. You fish it out and find a carved figurine, its edges softened by time but still recognizable. A tiny animal, maybe a buffalo, or maybe a dog, depending on how charitable your imagination is feeling tonight. The carving is crude, just enough to suggest a head, 4 stubby legs, and a tail, but it radiates a simple charm. It doesn't feel like a religious idol, it feels like a toy. You turn it over and over and you can't help but picture a child gripping it in a small fist, trotting it along bamboo floorboards while making their own sound effects. Mainstream fact: archaeological digs in Southeast Asia often uncover miniature figurines that appear to be children's toys rather than ritual objects. They're usually carved from wood, clay, or bone, and while scholars sometimes want to label everything sacred, the wear marks tell a humbler story. Kids chewing on them, dragging them, breaking them. Next to the figurine rolls out a marble. Not glass, no, this one is stone, chipped, and lopsided, more like a bead that retired from jewelry to become a plaything. You roll it in your palm and it fits neatly. Children across time have always loved marbles, little globes they could flick or trade. Historians still argue whether such items were primarily toys or also used in divination games where rolling stones might predict outcomes. Maybe this marble was both, half prophecy, half playground fun. You smile, imagining the drawer's moment of inheritance. Perhaps the family's children were told to tidy up, and rather than carefully storing their toys, they swept them off the mat and into this box. Some things never change. Parents are still finding Lego bricks in laundry baskets today. A quirky tidbit: in some Javanese households, children carved their own toys from the leftover materials. A broken spindle whorl became a top. A scrap of bamboo became a flute. A clay marble hardened in the hearth became a prized ball. This little figurine might have been made by a child themselves or by a patient older sibling. It wasn't built to last, but it lasted a millennium anyway. As you hold these objects, you realize how rarely history lets us see children. Chronicles and temple inscriptions are all about kings and priests. Toys are among the few things that whisper the presence of the youngest voices. This drawer, then, is not just an archive of trade and household chores, it's a playground in miniature. You imagine the sounds: giggles bouncing against bamboo walls, the slap of marbles on a woven mat, the whispered arguments of siblings fighting over the figurine. Maybe the toy animal even had a name. Maybe it was carried outside into the dirt yard, forgotten under a banana plant, rediscovered later, and finally dropped into the drawer because nobody wanted to throw it away. And here's the funny parallel. You probably have a drawer full of similar relics today. A missing puzzle piece, a broken action figure, a keychain that was once part of a McDonald's Happy Meal. You keep them not because they're useful, but because they hum with memory. This drawer hums in exactly the same register. One fringe theory claims some figurines doubled as teaching tools. Miniature buffalo to teach children about the animals they'd one day herd. Miniature boats to inspire dreams of sailing. And while it sounds academic, you know that for a 5-year-old, no justification is necessary. A toy is simply a toy. You chuckle softly because you can picture the scene clearly. An adult rummaging in the drawer for a needle or a prayer bead, their hand brushing the little figurine instead. They sigh, smile despite themselves, and set it back down. Even then, nostalgia was stronger than practicality. You set the marble down, and it wobbles in its chipped imperfection, before settling against the figurine. Side by side, they look like two siblings waiting for the game to resume. But the house is silent, the children long gone. Only you remain, half dreaming, half storytelling, giving their laughter back for a few moments. You leave the toy buffalo and the chipped marble nestled together, and your hand grazes something that sparkles faintly, even under the muted light of age. You pinch it between your fingers and lift out a shell, its spiral gleaming pale against the dark wood. Not just any shell, this one seems polished smooth, as though someone once rubbed it endlessly between their palms. You tilt it, listening instinctively for the roar of the ocean, though, of course, nothing comes. Mainstream fact: shells were a common presence in Javanese households, carried inland from the coast or traded along river routes. Sometimes they were used as ornaments, sometimes as offerings, and often they were simply pretty objects to pocket. Historians still argue whether shells like this were primarily decorative or symbolic, especially when they turn up in unexpected inland villages. This one in the drawer feels like both. Next to the shell, a small stone glitters faintly. It's not a gem, no, it's quartz, the kind of thing you'd find if you dug long enough in a riverbed. Yet you can picture a child presenting it proudly to their parents. Look, it shines. And what parent has the heart to throw away a shiny rock? Into the drawer it went, its magic preserved not by intrinsic value but by sentiment. And then there's the oddest piece, a sliver of mica, wafer-thin, translucent, catching the light like glass. You imagine it once kept in the drawer because of its uncanny shimmer. A quirky tidbit. In some Southeast Asian traditions, shiny stones were thought to ward off bad luck, their sparkle confusing mischievous spirits. Whether or not this family believed that, the mica glimmers in your palm like a frozen fragment of moonlight. These objects blur the line between sacred relic and junk. A polished shell could be a talisman against sickness, or it could just be something a child liked to fiddle with. A quartz pebble might represent Earth's hidden wealth, or it might simply be the cool rock of its day. Human habit is funny that way. Sometimes we ascribe cosmic meaning, sometimes we just like the way something looks. You chuckle softly because the parallel is obvious. Your own drawers probably hold a souvenir pebble from a beach trip, a coin you swore was lucky, or a keychain bauble that has no function except to please the eye. Across centuries, humans have hoarded shiny nonsense. One fringe theory claims some stones were used in divination, rolled like dice to interpret omens. It's tempting to imagine the quartz and mica in that role, but the wear on them looks more like fidgeting than ritual. Someone probably just liked the feel of them. That's the open secret of human history. Sometimes we keep things not because of their utility or symbolism, but simply because they're fun to touch. The shell feels particularly poignant. You imagine the family who owned the drawer living inland, far from the waves. The shell, then, would have been more than decoration. It would have been a tangible link to the sea, a reminder of journeys made or relatives living by the coast. Perhaps it was gifted, perhaps traded, perhaps just picked up on a pilgrimage. Whatever its story, its spiral hums with longing for places beyond the village walls. And you can almost see it. A child turning the shell over in lamplight, pretending it was treasure, dreaming of distant shores. Later, that same child grew up, lost interest, and the shell slid to the bottom of the drawer. Yet here it remains centuries later, still whispering of salt water. You smile because these trinkets feel universal. They're the junk jewelry of every culture. Things too valueless to sell, too charming to discard. This drawer has become a shrine of the almost valuable, where shells, stones, and mica slivers nestle beside coins and broken combs, glowing faintly in obscurity. When you place them back, the shell clicks softly against the quartz pebble, like a secret handshake between fellow survivors of irrelevance. They seem to say, "We may not have mattered much then, but we've lasted longer than empires." You slide the shimmering mica back into its dusty nook, and your fingers snag on something jagged. You tug gently and lift out a shard of metal, dull gray-green from corrosion, its edges uneven. It looks like it once belonged to a knife blade, though the point has long since snapped off. You turn it in your palm, and it scratches faintly, proof that once upon a time it sliced through more than just centuries of silence. Mainstream fact: iron tools were already well established in Java by the 11th century, used for farming, woodworking, and daily chores. A household might own a small knife for cutting betel nuts, slicing vegetables, or trimming bamboo. This shard, bent and broken, probably became useless, but not worthless enough to throw away. And so it landed here, an orphaned blade in a drawer full of fragments. Next to it, you notice a smaller sliver of bronze with one side smooth flat. Could it be part of a chisel? Or maybe the ferrule of a wooden handle long rotted away. Historians still argue whether households of middling wealth made their own tools or relied entirely on blacksmith guilds. Either way, the presence of broken bits here suggests a tinkerer's mindset, someone who kept spare parts around, hoping one day to refashion them into something useful. And then, tucked between wood dust, you find a nail. Not a modern shiny nail, but a squat, hand-forged piece of iron, pitted with rust. You hold it up and it feels oddly familiar because nails are timeless. From holding together bamboo mats to fastening planks on boats, they were the quiet backbone of everyday construction. A quirky tidbit. Archaeologists sometimes find nails deliberately bent before being deposited in shrines, a ritual act meant to lock in protection. This one, though, looks more like it bent accidentally, the victim of a stubborn piece of wood. Still, who knows? The more you examine these fragments, the clearer the picture grows. This drawer wasn't just a place for pretty trinkets. It was also a graveyard for tools that failed their jobs. A knife too dull to sharpen, a chisel fragment too short to grip, a nail too bent to reuse. Each tossed aside but kept within reach, because maybe, just maybe, they could be melted down, repurposed, or simply serve as spare bits in some future project. Sound familiar? You've got the same logic applied to Allen keys from IKEA furniture, don't you? You smile at the thought of the house's owner squatting on the floor, squinting at the broken blade, muttering in frustration. Into the drawer it went, along with a mental note to ask the smith about it next market day. That trip, of course, never happened. One fringe theory says that some broken tools were kept intentionally as household charms, embodying the principle of once useful, always powerful. A snapped blade might protect a house against theft, because even in death it symbolized sharpness. Maybe that's overthinking it. Or maybe the line between tool and talisman was thinner than we realize. The knife shard makes you wonder what it once cut. Was it a kitchen knife, scraping charred rice from a pot? A beetle nut cutter, brightening teeth red with each chew? A woodcarver's blade, shaping toys like the buffalo figurine you just saw? You'll never know, but the possibilities make the metal feel heavier than its size. The bronze sliver tells another story. Perhaps woodworking. Java's architecture relied heavily on timber, and chisels were indispensable. Imagine the rhythmic tapping of a mallet, the chisel shaving down bamboo poles for a fence. Then, snap. A curse, a sigh, and the piece disappears into the drawer's abyss. And the nail? Well, you can almost see the scene. Someone hammering it into a plank, it bending sideways stubbornly. They yank it out, annoyed, toss it toward the drawer with muttered words that echo across centuries. Useless thing. Funny how little that emotion has changed. You place the shards back carefully, almost tenderly. In their silence, they still hum with the labor of hands long gone. The drawer at this point feels less like random storage and more like an archive of frustrations. A collection of things that broke at the wrong moment, but refused to be entirely discarded. And as you let the lid rest half closed for a moment, you chuckle softly. Imagine trying to explain to the original owner that in 1,000 years, someone would handle their broken knife shard as though it were treasure. They'd probably laugh, shake their head, and say, "You want this? Really? Take it." You shift the blade shards and bent nail aside, and the mood of the drawer changes. The next handful of clutter has a softer, more fragrant quality, less about labor and more about faith. At the very bottom lies a scatter of tiny spheres, shriveled and brown, but still recognizable as lotus seeds. They are dry as paper now, fragile enough to crumble if you press too hard. In their prime, though, they would have been plump offerings left at a shrine or temple corner. Mainstream fact. The lotus, sacred across India and Southeast Asia, symbolized purity, its bloom rising unsullied from mud. In Java, where Hindu-Buddhist traditions blended fluidly, lotus seeds were common in rituals. Beside them nestles a tiny clay stupa, no bigger than your thumb. The detail is faint, smoothed by fingers long ago, but you can still make out its domed body and spire. Miniature stupas like this were popular devotional tokens. Pilgrims pressed them from clay at temples such as Borobudur, often leaving them behind as offerings or taking them home as keepsakes. Historians still argue whether such miniatures were mass-produced for pilgrims or handmade by devotees themselves. This one, cracked along its base, ended up in the drawer instead of an altar, its purpose cut short. And then a dusting of ash. When you brush it, the smell rises faintly, even now. Charred, woody, a whisper of incense. Some of it clings stubbornly to a fragment of rolled bamboo that was probably once an incense stick. A quirky tidbit. Old Javanese households sometimes blended coconut husk, tree resin, and herbs to make incense sticks by hand. Light one, and the room would fill with sweet smoke, thought to guide prayers upward and confuse evil spirits into losing their way. You imagine someone lighting such a stick in this very household, watching the smoke coil and vanish, then later sweeping the burnt stub into the drawer rather than discarding it outside. You pause here because this pile feels different. These are not broken tools or trinkets of play. These are objects that once sat in a space of reverence. Their journey into the drawer is puzzling. Did someone decide they were too worn to be sacred, but too delicate to throw away? Were they tucked aside respectfully, the way some families today store worn rosaries or broken prayer books? One fringe theory suggests households sometimes stored expired ritual items until they could be ritually disposed of, burned, buried, or cast into water. Maybe this drawer was a holding space, a kind of liminal waiting room for the half-sacred. That would explain the mix of seeds, ash, and mini stupa, all caught between devotion and discard. You smile at the familiarity. Even today, people tuck broken religious trinkets into boxes and drawers rather than tossing them in the trash. The instinct to honor what once had meaning doesn't fade easily. You imagine the daily rhythm again. Morning incense lit in front of a household shrine, children watching the smoke curl while seeds are scattered in a small bowl. Later, when the seeds dried and shriveled, when the incense was only ash, they were gathered and pushed into this drawer. Nothing dramatic, just a cycle of reverence and practicality. The miniature stupa fascinates you most. Perhaps it came from a pilgrimage to Borobudur, that vast stone mountain of carved reliefs and Buddha statues. Pilgrims would press clay into wooden molds, creating hundreds of tiny stupas and Buddhas to leave behind. But maybe this one was pocketed, carried home, cracked on the journey, and quietly shelved into obscurity. If so, it holds a direct link between the drawer and one of the world's greatest monuments. And you can almost see it. Someone kneeling, pressing their thumb into damp clay, feeling both ordinary and transcendent. Then, centuries later, you sitting here, turning the cracked relic in your hand, listening to it whisper of forgotten prayers. The ashes crumble under your touch, leaving faint smudges on your skin. For a heartbeat, you smell smoke that isn't there. It's easy to believe the drawer is breathing the last sighs of its incense, long after the household itself fell silent. You set the seeds, stupa, and ash back together, arranging them in a little constellation. And in that moment, the junk drawer feels like a miniature temple, cluttered, imperfect, but still glowing faintly with reverence. You rest the cracked stupa back in its corner, and your hand comes away sticky with something darker. You rub your fingers together and realize it's tar, old, hardened, black as pitch. At first it seems out of place among prayer beads and incense ash, but then you notice what it's clinging to. A scrap of fiber rope, twisted and stiff, its end frayed. You hold it up and the smell comes faintly. Ocean, smoke, resin. This isn't household clutter, this is maritime clutter. Mainstream fact. By the 10th and 11th centuries, Javanese seafarers were renowned across the Indian Ocean. Their ships called Jong in later chronicles carried spices, textiles, and ceramics to China, India, and beyond. To waterproof those hulking wooden hulls, they smeared seams with tar and resin, much like the sticky lump you're holding. A piece of rope smudged with tar, then, isn't just trash. It's a whisper of voyages that linked Java to half the known world. Next to the rope, tucked flat against the wood, is a bent sliver of metal that looks suspiciously like a fishhook. It's tiny, rusted, its curve still sharp enough to nick your thumb if you're careless. You imagine it tied to a line, dipped into a river or sea, bringing home fish for dinner. Historians still argue whether such hooks were locally forged or imported, since similar styles appear across Southeast Asia. Either way, this hook once pierced scales before ending up useless and bent, destined for the drawer. And then, almost hidden beneath rope fibers, lies a cluster of seashells. Unlike the polished talismans you saw earlier, these shells are rough, chalky, with tiny holes drilled in them. A quirky tidbit: sailors sometimes strung shells onto lines as cheap sinkers for fishing, or even wore them as charms to ward off drowning. You roll one in your palm, and the hole through it looks like it was worn thin from friction, proof it served more than ornamental duty. The mix here paints a picture. Someone in this household had a foot in the maritime world. Maybe a sailor, maybe a fisherman, maybe just a rope mender supplying the bigger ships. Whatever the role, the drawer became their dumping ground too. A frayed rope end too short to use, a bent hook, shells saved from nets. The sea had its place in this house, even if inland. One fringe theory claims tar lumps themselves were lucky charms. Sailors believed keeping a bit of pitch in the home ensured safe voyages, the sticky substance symbolizing bonds that held people together. Maybe this tar scrap was one such charm. Or maybe it was just too messy to toss outside, so someone shoved it in here with a sigh. You smile because you recognize the impulse. How many times have you tucked a bit of string or a bent nail into a drawer, telling yourself it might be useful someday? Human beings, landlocked or seafaring, share that same thriftiness. And so this family's maritime leftovers ended up resting beside grooming combs and incense ash. The rope fascinates you most. Its fibers are thick, suggesting it wasn't for tying packages, but for something heavier. Nets or sails? You picture a boat bobbing near the Javanese coast, its lines creaking, tar dripping onto the deck. A sailor, tired after docking, trims off the frayed end and pockets it absent-mindedly. Later, it finds its way into this drawer, a tiny relic of the sea. You pause, listening in imagination to the sounds such a rope would have known. Waves slapping wooden hulls, gulls shrieking, the creak of planks as wind filled sails. That rope once tied into those symphonies. Now it lies silent, its music replaced by the hush of dust. The fishhook makes you grin. Picture the frustration of someone losing a catch because this hook bent, tossing it aside with muttered curses. It's the 11th century equivalent of losing your best lure to a snag. Into the junk drawer it went, as if someone thought, maybe I'll fix it. They didn't, and you know they wouldn't. You place the tar lump, rope, hook, and shells back into the box, and you realize the drawer has broadened again. It's not just domestic, it's global. These scraps connect to voyages that spanned thousands of miles, to spices and ceramics traded across oceans. And yet, they rest here, intimate and homely, as if the world itself shrank down into a handful of junk. The smell of tar lingers faintly on your fingertips, but as you dig deeper, another aroma drifts up. Herbal, bitter, earthy. You find a small mortar shard, the rim of what was once a bowl for grinding. Its surface is pitted and dark, stained with something ground into powder 1,000 years ago. Nestled against it are dry, crumbling fragments of what look like herbs, their colors long gone, but their outlines still suggesting leaves and stems. You lift one piece carefully. It flakes instantly, nothing more than a husk. But if you bring it close, there's a phantom of scent, like turmeric or ginger, pungent in memory, if not in fact. Mainstream fact: Javanese households relied on a blend of herbal medicine and ritual healing. Recipes recorded later in Primban manuscripts list ginger, turmeric, betel, and galangal, as common cures for fevers, stomach aches, and spirit disturbances. This drawer, with its clumps and crumbs, was probably the overflow shelf for someone's personal pharmacy. Beside the herbs is a small clump of powder hardened into a lump. You rub it gently and a faint yellow stain smudges your finger. Maybe turmeric paste once used to treat a cut, or applied as a poultice. Historians still argue whether turmeric in Java was primarily valued as a dye, a spice, or a medicine. In practice, it was probably all three. This lump, forgotten in the drawer, whispers of someone's fever, someone's wound, a moment of care tucked into storage when no longer fresh. And then you find the oddest piece. A small packet, palm leaf folded into a tight square, its edges brittle but intact. Inside, when you peel it open carefully in your mind's eye, are dark granules, salt mixed with ash. A quirky tidbit. Such mixtures were once rubbed onto teeth or gums, believed to prevent toothache. Imagine a parent leaning over a squirming child, dabbing this mixture onto their mouth while the child groaned. Later, the leftover packet was shoved into the drawer, forgotten until you unearthed it centuries later. The mortar shard, the herb fragments, the turmeric lump, the tooth ash packet, they form a medical kit of sorts. Not organized, not pristine, but real. These were the band-aids and cough syrups of another era. One fringe theory suggests that mortars themselves were spiritual tools, not just medical. Some believed grinding herbs released their hidden essence, which wasn't only medicinal but also magical. That explains why healers sometimes chanted while crushing roots. Maybe the shard once belonged to such a healer, its stain less about turmeric and more about incantations whispered into powder. You imagine the scene. A child feverish on a bamboo mat. A grandmother crouched by the fire grinding herbs in this very mortar. The rhythmic thud of pestle against bowl. The bitter smell rising. The mixture smeared onto skin, swallowed with a grimace, rubbed into gums. Some nights it worked, some nights it didn't. But always the attempt. And then you think of your own drawer, probably containing half a tube of expired ointment, a bottle of painkillers from 5 years ago, cough drops melted together into one sticky mass. Same instinct. Keep the cure close even when it's half dead. The yellow stain on your fingertip makes you smile. Imagine if it was turmeric that left it. It's the same stuff that still stains wooden spoons in kitchens today. Across centuries, turmeric insists on permanence. Even a junk drawer can't erase its mark. You place the mortar shard back, resting it on the fragile herbs. The packet of tooth ash sits delicately beside them, as though waiting to be opened again. And for a moment, the drawer feels like a medicine chest, cluttered but caring, still echoing with the murmurs of a household that tried its best to soothe pain with what it had. You ease the medicine shard back into its nest, and something bright winks at you from the powdery dark. An eye of glass, small and round. You pinch it free and it rolls across your palm. A glass bead, the kind of color that refuses to grow old. A blue-green that might as well be fresh rain. There are more. 3, 4, then a small avalanche, some tubular, some perfectly round, a few worn flat from centuries of rubbing against neighbors. You string them loosely on an imaginary thread, and it's instantly obvious. Someone in this household kept souvenirs, and some of those souvenirs came a very long way. Mainstream fact. From late antiquity through the medieval period, millions of so-called Indo-Pacific glass beads traveled the oceans, carried in sacks on ships that stitched India, Southeast Asia, and the Swahili coast together. They turn up everywhere. Burials, marketplaces, house floors, because they were money, jewelry, status, and plaything all at once. Historians still argue whether the largest production centers for these particular beads in the 10th to 11th centuries were on the Coromandel coast of India, on Sri Lanka, or also in workshops dotted through island Southeast Asia, including Java. Your drawer, smug as ever, hedges no bets. It simply glitters. Mixed in with the beads is a heavier object, curved like a crescent moon. A bronze mirror fragment, its polished face gone matte, but the decorated back still readable if you tilt it just right. Spirals. Nubs. Maybe the ghost of an inscription. Chinese bronze mirrors were prized prestige goods. They could arrive as gifts, trade pieces, or heirlooms that outlived dynasties. A good mirror made sunlight look like it could be held in your hand. Here, only a shard remains. Yet even a shard can catch a sunbeam and throw it across a room like a tiny blessing. You hold the mirror bit up and see your own eyelash blur in it. A quirky tidbit. Across Asia, people sometimes tucked mirror shards near doorways to bounce misfortune away, the reflection confusing whatever trouble tried to enter. It's not hard to imagine this fragment once glued to a wooden frame over the household's threshold, then breaking off and slipping into the drawer during a hurried clean. Fringe or not, you can feel the logic. If glass can throw light, maybe it can deflect gloom. Worth a try, especially if it's already in your pocket from market day. Beneath the beads, your fingers find something smoother, chalk white, with a neat slit along its belly. A cowrie shell, the unmistakable little currency of the Indian Ocean. Turn it, and you notice a tiny perforation near the edge, the giveaway sign that it was strung, either for wearing or counting. Mainstream fact. Maldives cowries circulated as small change money from East Africa to Southeast Asia for centuries. In some places they bought bread, in others they paid temple dues. In many they were simply adornments that announced, "I have connections." This one has lost its gloss, but not its story. Now the drawer starts to feel like a tabletop at an 11th century customs office. Beads from an Indian furnace, a mirror from China, cowries from far-off atolls, and you, the unsuspecting traveler, trying to explain to a very serious clerk that, no, you do not have anything to declare except an unhealthy attachment to shiny things? If this were the modern world, you'd be the person whose suitcase is half fridge magnets. Yes, the drawer is judging you. Yes, it has the range. You sift again and find a sliver of greenish glass, flat and triangular. Too thin for a vessel, too small for a window. What was it? Maybe inlay from a box, or chip from a pendant, or just a casualty of a dropped bottle. Historians still argue whether high-quality colored glass in Java at this time was mostly imported, or whether local artisans were remelting and reworking imported cullet into new shapes. Either way, this tiny shard insists on being important simply by catching the light and refusing to let go. Here's a small, almost throwaway detail that says a lot. One of the beads is off-round, a little slumped at one end, like it was cooling when someone bumped the rod. It's the production error you'd never notice if you weren't turning it over slowly, hunting for fingerprints. You grin because it's the ancient equivalent of buying a hand-blown ornament with a bubble trapped inside, a flaw that proves the human hand. You picture how these travel souvenirs got here. Maybe the household head sailed with the tar-smudged rope you met earlier, trading rice and timber for beads and mirrors, coming home with pockets clinking. Maybe an inland merchant passed through, spreading his wares on a mat, tiny universes of color priced in handfuls. Maybe a visiting cousin brought the cowrie as a gift, laughing that it was money you can also wear. The point is, the drawer becomes a port. Ships dock in its shadow. Markets chatter in its corners. One fringe theory, odd but charming, claims that mirror shards in domestic spaces sometimes doubled as sun catchers to start kitchen fires quickly, focusing light like a magnifying glass. It's a stretch given bronze's reflectivity, but you can see someone trying, especially on a rainy morning with damp kindling. Practicality plus tinkering spirit is the drawer's whole brand. And there's humor here too, in the way a meaning keeps changing hands. A bead that once closed a deal becomes a child's marvel. A mirror that symbolized prestige becomes a lucky sliver taped to a doorframe. A cowrie that bought sweets ends up sleeping in dust. The drawer is where exchange rates go to zero and memory becomes the only currency that still spends. Mainstream fact, folded quietly in. Java of this era sat inside a web of maritime routes, often nicknamed the Monsoon Highway, with winds that reliably reversed seasonally, moving ships and ideas back and forth. That's why you find foreign odds in local houses and local odds in foreign ones. The ocean was a road. The drawer is your mile marker. You tilt your head, and the bronze shard flashes one last time. That flash catches on the beads, which wink back like polite party guests, and on the cowrie, which plays at being a tooth. And for a second, the whole mess becomes a necklace for the island itself. Little proofs that the world has always been busy, that no place stays still as long as people are breathing, trading, joking, tinkering. You tuck the souvenirs back with care in the way all good souvenirs demand. And you hear an echo of salesmanship from a millennium ago. Special price for you, friend. You smile because, in a way, you took the deal. You paid with attention, and the drawer gave you a journey. No receipt necessary. You nudge the travel trinkets into their glittery corner, and when your hand returns, it comes back dusted with something soft and shimmering, like powdered graphite with a secret. You pinch your fingertips together, and tiny scales break away. Moth dust. The delicate sprinkle that tells you you've stumbled into a tiny, accidental museum. The drawer has not only stored objects, it has curated tenants. And some of those tenants had wings. You peer closer and spot a bead of iridescence tucked in a crack. You coax it out and realize it's not a bead at all, but a beetle elytron, the smooth wing case of a jewel beetle, still flashing green the way a glass bead might pretend to. Mainstream fact. Beetle wing cases are made of chitin and often survive long after the rest of the insect vanishes. In parts of South and Southeast Asia, people even stitch them into textiles for their metallic shimmer. This single elytron must have ridden in on a cuff, or fallen off a windowsill trophy, or simply belonged to an insect who blundered into the drawer one humid night and never found the exit. Along the back rail you find husks, light as punctuation. A row of shed exoskeletons from something that molted here. Perhaps cockroaches, perhaps beetle larvae. You wrinkle your nose and then laugh, because come on, even kings have roaches. A house of woven bamboo and palm thatch in monsoon country is a collaboration with nature. Historians still argue whether insect remains and household deposits map neatly onto storage habits. Does a cluster of grain beetle shells prove a rice bin nearby, or did the bug simply wander from the yard? In tropical digs, boundaries blur like ink and rain. This drawer is both evidence and chaos. Near the mortar shard from earlier, your finger grazes a tiny brown pod glued to the wood. It peels off like a clipped fingernail and reveals a neat seam down one side. A cocoon, or more precisely an uthica from a praying mantis or a roach. A styrofoam-looking capsule that once housed many small lives. It's creepy cute, like a bubble-wrap sleeve for babies. You set it on your palm and imagine it clinging there 1,000 years earlier. The household listening to soft crackles as new bodies wriggled out into lamplight. The corners hold more trophies. A papery moth wing, triangular and torn, still dusting your skin with scales when you breathe too hard. A tiny wasp nest cell, hexagon repeated into a scrap of comb. And on the underside of the lid, a smear of dried mud sculpted into tubes. The calling card of a mud dauber wasp, an architect who plasters pantries with organ pipe chambers and stocks them with paralyzed spiders like a miser stacking coins. Quirky tidbit. Mud dauber tubes have been found baked onto rafters and even ancient statues. When they crumble, they leave little bricklets of history no broom sees until centuries later. Here, the dauber vaulted the ceiling of the world's smallest cathedral, a junk drawer. You grin, because the household's relationship with insects was probably both practical and resigned. Gecko chirps at dusk? Free pest control. Ant parade across the rice jar? Free lesson in lid placement. A beetle wing caught in a hairpin? Free fashion upgrade until it fell off and joined the drawer's diaspora. And while you're smiling, you remember the crocodile dung sunscreen rumor from earlier and think, fine, maybe insects weren't the strangest bathroom product in circulation after all. There's a brittle thread clinging to one husk. For a blink, you think it's textile fiber, but under the light, it glows like spun glass. Spider silk, probably stretched from a web routed through the bead pile. Somewhere in this house, long before the tar-smudged rope ever moaned in a storm, spiders stitched nightly scaffolds over bowls and combs and coins. You suspect the family let them work because spiders eat mosquitoes, and in humid Java, that's an alliance worth honoring. You look again at the elytron's color and it throws you a memory. The blue-green glass beads from a moment ago. The overlap is delicious. Trade brought glass that pretended to be insect. The yard brought insects that pretended to be jewels. Between the two, the drawer became a low-budget constellation. If the household child ever lined beetle wings and beads together on a mat, they were doing comparative materials science between bedtime prayers and sambal. Mainstream fact slips in quietly. Palm leaf manuscripts in Southeast Asia often bear the bite marks of silverfish and book lice, tiny feeders on starch and glue. That brittle palm scrap back in the writing section? It probably tasted like a bakery to the drawer's arthropod patrons. Historians still argue whether heavily chewed manuscripts indicate poor storage or simply tropical inevitability. You're voting inevitability, given the moth snow currently pollinating your imagination. You find a smear the color of dried cherry on the bottom plank, and for a second you think, blood? Calm down. More likely lax, resin from the lac insect, which people across the region harvested for varnish, adhesive, and even dye. If that's what it is, it connects your insect museum to trade again. Shellac sealing boxes, lac dye tinting threads the spindle whirl once spun. It's oddly satisfying, the way the tiniest creature becomes the gloss on a boat plank or the glow in a textile. You pause to listen for a moment, and of course you hear nothing. But your brain insists on furnishing a soundscape anyway. The fizzing quiet of moths just out of reach. The dry click of beetle feet on wood. The wet pop of a mud dauber slapping in another mouthful. You picture a parent shooing a child away from the open drawer. Don't stir up the moths. Which is hilarious because you are absolutely stirring up the moths. 2 jokes in and counting, the drawer is heckling you for your pacing. A fringe theory floats by like a gnat. Some households intentionally kept beetle wings and butterfly scales as ingredients in amulets, believing their iridescence confounded jealous spirits the way mirror shards did. Maybe the family tucked elytra into a small palm packet, alongside cloves and rice grains. Or maybe someone just thought, ooh, shiny, and that was the end of the ritual. Your vote, respectfully, is both. You think of how often our homes curate nature without asking. A windowsill of beetle shells, a chandelier of spider webs we pretend we don't see before guests arrive, a porch light that convenes a nightly insect TED Talk. The Javanese house was no different. Walls that breathed, floors that invited, rafters that welcomed. And this drawer was simply the final resting place of creatures who showed up to the party and then forgot where the door was. You set the elytron dead center atop the mica from earlier, and it throws a greener gleam than glass can manage. The moth dust on your fingertips looks like eyeshadow, which is funny because people still go outside wearing shimmer named beetle and opal. Nature did the palette first. Sephora just gave it a skew. Your last sweep finds a half cocoon fused to a turmeric smear from the medicine cabinet section, a collaboration between patient and patient. It feels right. The drawer has always been about collaborations. Clove with rice, rope with tar, beads with mirrors, toys with tools, devotion with ash. Of course, insects signed the guest book too, in shimmering scales and mud architecture and little pods like commas in a sentence you're still reading out loud. You blow gently and watch a tiny snow of scales swirl and settle like the softest indoor weather. If you weren't already drowsy, that would do it. The hush of wings reduced to dust, the museum closing itself down, exhibit by exhibit, until all that remains is the faintest glitter, the slowest breath, the patient box. You leave the moth dust shimmering in the air, and at last you realize you've reached the drawer's end. Every shard, bead, shell, rope, and husk has had its say, and now what remains is the silence that binds them. You linger with the lid half open, your fingertips resting on the rim, not ready to close it yet. The drawer feels less like storage and more like a time capsule, one that no one meant to make but which became a museum all the same. You picture the house around it, long since collapsed. Woven bamboo walls sagging in monsoon rains, clay roof tiles cracking, floor mats rotting back into soil. All gone. Only this little wooden drawer remains intact enough to tell stories. Historians still argue whether objects like this should be read as deliberate archives or random survival. But you've sat with it long enough to know randomness is the whole point. A curated treasure chest is impressive. A junk drawer is human. You run through its contents again in your mind. The broken comb snagging hair, the hairpin etched with spirals, the half-used incense, the snapped spindle whorl, the toy buffalo, the glimmering mica, the bent fishhook, the turmeric clump, the glass beads. None of them would make a headline on their own, yet together they sketch the outline of a household that was alive with touch, scent, laughter, frustration. That household never imagined their clutter would outlive their names, but here you are giving voice to their fragments. One fringe theory floats back, that keeping broken things preserves their essence. A shard of mirror still reflects, a bent nail still anchors luck, a dried seed still promises renewal. You can see why people believed it. After all, this drawer is brokenness incarnate, and yet it holds a wholeness larger than any one piece. You chuckle softly because the parallel is obvious. Look at your own nightstand drawer right now. The expired batteries, the tangled earbuds, the pen that leaks. If someone unearthed that in 1,000 years, what wild stories would they tell about you? Maybe they'd argue over whether the earbuds were ritual objects or currency. Maybe they'd think the leaking pen was used in medicine. The joke is on us. We are all curators of accidental museums. Now, at last, you lower the lid. The wood creaks faintly like a sigh of relief. Dust motes swirl and then settle. The drawer's contents slip back into sleep, their voices dimming to murmurs. And you, sitting in the half-light, realize that you've traveled not just across centuries, but across the hidden rooms of ordinary life. And so we let the drawer rest, clutter intact, stories sealed again. If anyone opens it after you, they'll find the same jumble, but not the same whispers. Those belong to you tonight, and they've already begun to fade into the hush of your breathing. And now, with the lid of that Javanese drawer closed, it's time to slow everything down. The clink of coins, the scratch of bamboo pens, the faint perfume of cloves, all of it drifts away like smoke curling into the night. What remains is only softness, the sense of small, ordinary lives pressing gently against the silence of time. Let your shoulders loosen as if you've set down something heavy. You've walked through kitchens filled with turmeric, workshops buzzing with thread, temples hazy with incense, beaches humming with seashell souvenirs, and rooms alive with children's laughter and moth wings. But now all of that sound dissolves into quiet, as though the drawer itself is closing inside your mind. The images blur, beads glimmering like stars, a toy buffalo frozen mid-step, a spindle whorl that once spun song into cotton. They all fade until they are no more than outlines, gentle echoes against the dark. You don't need to hold on to them. They've already told their stories and now they're resting, the way you should be resting. Breathe deeply, slowly. Imagine the hum of night insects outside a bamboo house, steady and comforting. Imagine a faint breeze sneaking through woven walls, carrying the scent of cloves and wood smoke. Imagine the quietest part of the village when even the roosters have gone silent. And as you settle into that rhythm, you realize that history isn't always about kings or empires. Sometimes it's about broken combs and bent nails, about the quiet persistence of small things. Tonight, you've honored those things and now you can let them go. Close your eyes. Drift. Let the junk drawer of time slide shut. You are safe, you are still, and the night is waiting to carry you into dreams.